So I just briefly want to go over some challenges and the future for organizations looking at organizational development, and primarily also looking at the very last of those 5 stages of OD, the removal of the OD specialist from the actual process. And I do want to kind of clarify that it's not necessarily the complete removal of the OD specialist, it's a changing of the role. In other words, the real goal of an OD specialist, whether internal or external, is to create an organization that is self-renewing in its own organizational development. And the role then becomes more of a monitor and a resource for other people in the organization to help implement their own changes. So though it's phrased in the book and it's framed as if it is the OD specialist leaving the organization, that's kind of an external OD viewpoint on it. It's more of, especially because a lot of organizations now have organizational development departments that are permanent parts of the organization, we're really more focused on the idea of the changing nature that at the start, OD is going to be about trying to change the entire organization's culture and structure to where the organization itself welcomes development. And once that occurs, the organizational development specialist is no longer necessarily a part of the change agents. They're now a resource and a provider of additional interventions that teams and people within the organization can come to when they recognize the need for change themselves. So you go from being more of an active change agent to an available resource. So one thing I really want to talk about briefly is Kirkpatrick's 4-level training evaluation model. So this wasn't necessarily developed for organizational development, but I think it's an interesting, again, model to kind of conceptualize and use when determining is an intervention working. And the idea behind this is that Kirkpatrick says that whenever we're actually doing a program of training, in an organization, there are basically 4 levels that we can measure, and that the first one is the easiest, and the fourth one is the hardest, so going from bottom to top. The first one also tells us the least, and the top one tells us the most. So whenever we're actually determining in that cycle of organizational development, is these interventions working, it's a good idea to also have Kirkpatrick's 4-level training evaluation model in mind. How are we actually measuring performance or success of an intervention? And what levels are we actually gathering data on? So just briefly, level 1 is simply reaction. To what degree do participants react favorably to the learning event, or in this case, to the intervention? So this is just surveys, interviews, focus groups. We're not actually measuring any particular outcome. We're simply asking people, how did you like it? So a good example of this in a class is at the end of most classes, you'll often fill out an evaluation form of the class asking you to rate how much you liked the instruction, the structure of the course, the textbook, the overall teaching. And it's asking you to respond on your beliefs. I feel like this was a good class, or I feel like it could have been better. That's just getting at the reaction. That doesn't actually tell us, did you learn or not? That did not actually tell us, are you incorporating what you learned into your everyday life? So as we move forward, the next level is learning. To what degree do participants acquire the intended knowledge, skills, and attitudes based on their participation in the learning event? Now again, in most classes, we have that as well. So you have a grade in this class. So the first level is your evaluation of the class itself. You're asked your opinion at the end of a class. Did you like it? Did you like the teacher? Did you like the textbook? That's a reaction measurement. The next one is learning. Did you actually learn the information you were supposed to? And we can assess that through your paper writing, your participation in discussion, and your quiz performance, all of which goes into your grade. So that's a level 2 learning. But learning it in an organization doesn't mean you're using it. And again, think of this as an intervention. So did you like the intervention? Did you understand the intervention would be level 2. Level 3 is behavior. To what degree did participants apply what they learned during training or are using the intervention when they're back on the job? So basically, again, level 3, the only way that we can assess level 3 in most kind of courses at a college level is if we followed up with you in an organization. Now, this is a little bit different because in this case, you're taking a class to learn information, and we're not necessarily a part of a corporate training program where I can come into your work now and go. Are you actually changing how you behave in the organization? Are you implementing what you learned in this class? But that's level 3. And finally, level 4, does those implementations of those new behaviors actually result in real outcomes for the organization? So notice that each one of these becomes a little harder to measure. Reaction, very easy to measure. Any kind of implementation, any kind of intervention, you can simply just create quick surveys. Did you think it was a good idea? Did you like this intervention? Did you like the way we're doing things? You get your attitude. Learning, you can actually quiz people. You can gather information of are they actually getting the information or implementing, at least in the immediate time frame, the new way of doing things. Level 3, though, takes time. Does that behavior continue to stick? Are we seeing someone transferring these new methods day after day, longer term, into what they're actually doing in their jobs? And finally, level 4 is even a longer term and harder to measure. And does those behavioral changes actually result in subsequent reinforcement and outcomes? Is the organization actually getting its dollars worth? Are you actually performing better? So we want to question whenever we're actually evaluating an intervention, how many of these levels can we measure? And ideally, we want to measure all 4. The future organization, so just looking forward, organizational development as a field is kind of thinking about our, again, being proactive. So this is OD on OD. So experts in OD, we have journals, we have conferences, and we often talk about where is OD heading, and the OD is basically, as a field, looking at trying to move more and more organizations into what we often refer to as a future organization. So a constantly changing organization, an organization that's flexible and able to change quickly, higher education levels meaning increase in motivational needs, and the idea that change is never ending. In other words, the trends that we see in our field is that overall we're seeing more and more need for organizations to be flexible and to change, and that most organizations are utilizing higher and higher levels of skills in the people they hire, and people with those skills do need to be addressed differently than people with lower levels of skill. So even in very simplistic organizations, work is becoming more technological, work is requiring more skills, which means the people that can do those skills need to have their motivational needs met by organizations. So we started with the 5 stages of OD. Stage 1, anticipate the need for change. Stage 2, develop a relationship between the people in the organization driving the change and the change agent themselves, the OD specialist. Diagnose the problem, gather data, make sure that what the problem is initially identified is the problem that actually needs to be addressed. Come up with action plans, strategies, and techniques, and then implement them until they're self-renewing, stabilized, and at that point, if they're working, possibly disengaged. So again, that stage 5 is the monitor and stabilize. So we're gathering feedback from the success of the programs, hopefully using all 4 of Kirkpatrick's levels. We're stabilizing the change. We're making sure that it sticks. We're evaluating the program results. Are we actually gathering data long-term that's showing the behaviors are sticking and that the actual results we intended are actually occurring because of the intervention? And at that point, we're terminating the practitioner-client relationship as far as the practitioner being an active change agent, because just like we want management to empower individuals to make decisions, as an OD specialist, we want to empower employees to be able to take over, to some degree, their own OD interventions. So stabilizing and monitoring change, do we see acceptance and adaptation of the change? We do want to guard against fade out, though. So the idea that we see the change initially and just assume that it's going to continue, we've got to remember that the old way of doing things, especially if the old way was somewhat supported by the culture, can easily make a reemergence, there's the word I was looking for, a reemergence, if we're not looking out for it. Reinforcement may be necessary to make sure the new way does stick, and continued assessment of change during the future as we move forward. So just some brief words on terminating the practitioner and client relationship, and this is more of a termination when it's an external relationship and more of a changing of roles if it's internal. This is the final stage of OD, occurs when a practitioner or client believes little more can currently be accomplished, and the disengagement will likely call for a gradual reduction of the practitioner's help. I find myself primarily working as an external consultant. There usually is a clear distinction of when a project is over, the organization is happy with the results, I'm no longer necessarily on contract, but there's usually going to be a few, they'll check in with me occasionally. They may actually ask me to do a small little micro project afterwards. They may actually call me back 3 months later and go, can we get a quick basically remeasure of whether this is sticking? But it is going to be this gradual reduction, and at some point I'm really going to lose contact with that organization. And again, the ideal though is that the organization itself will create a self-renewing organization that constantly is able to innovate and integrate its own OD in its behaviors. Role of values and complex dilemmas. This is kind of what's the current status of the field of OD. So one problem is there's no single accreditation program for OD practitioners, which does mean that as you're leaving this class, be a little careful when someone says they're an OD consultant. Find out what is their training, find out what's their past experience, ask for references, because there are people that are operating in this space with very little training, probably less training that you now have from having taken this course. We do have to be careful that OD does tend to immediately tend to fall back to 2 or 3 major interventions, one of them being team building, which tends to overemphasize the human intervention part of OD while ignoring the structural parts of OD. There is controversy over what exactly is OD and what are OD techniques, and we kind of talked about that a little bit as far as the gray zone between OD and OT, both of which basically use the same interventions. It's also difficult for OD to deal with power. So a part of the whole process of the assumption of OD is we're wanting to empower or move power from upper levels to more spread out through the organization. And often, a lot of times where OD runs into problems as far as a field is that reluctance to give up that power and how OD is trying to deal with power, especially if the organizational development specialist is internal to the organization. And quite honestly, OD offers very few short-term techniques to organizations in crisis. In other words, we've got a lot of research behind what we do in OD and the interventions we've discussed in this class and how successful they are when given time, culture, and resources to support those changes. We have a lot less information of what we can do in a meaningful way that's a reliable technique in short-term crisis situations. So much so that the field of OD has basically created a second category, OT, to represent what we don't do. And that's not really the greatest of solutions. So that's another thing just kind of moving forward to be aware as a shortcoming within the field.